there's one thing you might have noticed I don't complain about. Politicians. Everybody complains about politicians. Everybody says they suck. Well, where do people think these politicians come from? They don't fall out of the sky. They don't pass through a membrane from another reality. They come from American parents and American families, American homes, American schools, American churches, American businesses, and American universities, and they're elected by American citizens. This is what we have to offer. It's what our system produces. It's what our system produces. Garbage in, garbage out. If you have selfish, ignorant citizens, you're going to get selfish, ignorant leaders. The term limits ain't going to do you any good. You're just going to wind up with a brand new bunch of selfish, ignorant Americans. So maybe it's not the politicians who suck. Maybe something else sucks around here. Like the public. Because if it's really just the fault of these politicians, then where are all the other bright people of conscience? Where are all the bright, honest, intelligent Americans ready to step in and save the nation and lead the way? We don't have people like that in this country. Everybody's at the mall, scratching his ass, picking his nose, taking his credit card out of his fanny pack and buying a pair of sneakers with lights in them. It's what our system produces. It's what our system produces.
Very well stated by one of the greatest social scientists of our time, at least in the public arena, George Carlin. He was one of my first major influences that made me begin to think about society. Even though Carlin, if you hear him speak, he tended to be very cynical, and his approach to society sort of acted like he didn't care. He very much did. I was fortunate to be able to talk to him once briefly in Manhattan, and he was just an amazing guy. It's really a terrible loss, and I don't see anybody out there, really talking about the things that are really important. But nevertheless, homage to Mr. Carlin. So I have 99 questions here. I'm going to try to go through the really great questions. I really appreciate the thought you guys have put into these questions. Before I do so, basically, I want to go through some quick points about the movement that are developing. I'm giving a lot of thought to Zeitgeist Day 2010 right now, and what we're going to do, whether it's in New York or not, most likely it will be. We're actually going to try and get a building to do the event. Excuse me. Get a building that has 3 floors, possibly, to have a weekend type of event, an expo. I'm going to try and get the money and the funds to bring up all of Fresco's models. I'm going to try and get people to do more 3D renderings of the cities and specific concepts. Try and get people that advocate different sociological interests that are very relevant to come and speak. Try to make a big event where people come and they engage and they see and they experience, as opposed to, say, an event where someone's just speaking for a couple hours and that's the end of it. And on that note, there's another thing that I'm attempting to get together, and I'm going to call it the Zeitgeist Media Project or something like that. And I want those in the communication or creative teams to begin to think about how you would communicate through media, if hopefully you're involved in this in some way, if you do film editing or if you're a music composer or you're an artist in some fashion, anything in regards to the communication spectrum in media, you can begin to contribute to what could be an element that participates in Zeitgeist 2010 Z-Day. This would be cataclysmic if we can get everyone to start to, even people that are technologically oriented, that could contribute their own concepts that they feel are in line with this, and then bring themselves and their ideas, their models, or their experiments, or what have you, to this event and show the collaboration, show the input, show the experience, show the development of this. So this is something that I'm trying to get together now, and you're going to hear more about this very soon. A media project. The initial intent, even though I want to use this for Zeitgeist Day, of course, is to just flood the internet. So say, for example, we have a networking system where filmmakers can get together, because I don't want to be the only person making films on these subjects. We need more people out there doing anything and everything. So you get together with people that have certain disciplines that can complement each other and make a film. And you do it, and hopefully not for profit. If you wanted to do something that was whatever your mainstream release and things like that, that's great. It's a collaborative thing. Obviously, there's many different avenues for this. We still live in a monetary system. But nevertheless, the idea would be to get people to contribute media, develop media, 3D renders, maybe even storylines or social experiments that could be advocated through film, and or books or anything, and get it out there and create a project that's about expressing through art, through creativity, these ideas. And this is something I think is going to be very, very effective if we can do it. So that's that really fast. And let's see here. The state chapters and other international chapters are also developing. We're going to have a full separate server for all U.S. state chapters. I'm going to pull in either one person or multiple people to head the state chapter in their respective state. This has been developing. I think some of you out there have already talked to you about this. We're getting the templates together. You'll also notice on the Gateway page we have some officially recognized international chapters. I'm experimenting with this to see if they can handle it. I've been in touch with everybody. I'm going to be more so in touch with them that are heading these particular countries, because this has to get off the ground, and I need to get the push on this with people that are really dedicated, and the real dedication will come through when they start getting people contacting them, which is why they're on the Gateway page, to sort of figure out who's really into this, or who's has the time to do it and who really doesn't, and what have you. It's always a difficult thing with people volunteering their time. I totally appreciate everything everyone's done with these blogs and everything else, but we do need people that are dedicated and centralized, so to speak. Centralized in the sense that they're the ones that are going to attempt to organize their communities, and they're willing to do so and dedicate the time necessary. So that's developing as well. The chapters are going to be extremely important. I mentioned that last broadcast, but you're going to hear me talk about that more. So eventually we need a massive holographic web, and that's the goal, stretching across the planet. So I covered that. And one quick note, I made a comment about the Australian Truth Movement, how I might be going to Australia. I was in contact with, I believe it's AustralianTruthMovement.com, and I made comments about ticket prices and things like this, and the need for me to do it for in a nonprofit way. And some people emailed the head of Truth Movement Australia again in a very negative capacity. Actually, Adam in Truth Movement has been very kind with all of this, and regardless of the history of his other events, he's willing to put forward this project because he believes in it in a nonprofit way. So please don't send him any more negative emails. I just had to comment on that. I kind of felt bad. There's some misinterpretations there. Hopefully I didn't state things that poorly. And that's that. One small thing, correction from last broadcast. I referred to human beings as carnivores, and of course we are omnivores. I just misspoke. I was relating carnivorous notions to herbivorous. So I saw that on a post, so I might as well correct myself for the sake of integrity. All right, let's go straight into your questions. The best question is the first one. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say the number, I'm going to read the question, and I'll give a pause. When I listened back to the radio show, I noticed there's some confusion because you can't quite tell whether I'm reading a question or I'm making statements because of the way they read. But I'm going to try and make this more clear. Number one, if I understood correctly, decisions in a resource-based economy would be made by putting forward a request or idea to a computer, which then will implement a solution or not. Well, I'll stop you right there. It's not the implementation necessarily as the analysis. It's hard to oversimplify. It's easy to oversimplify this, but I'm gonna let that be and just keep going. Given that some people are simply more intelligent than others, let me stop you there too. Some people are not more intelligent; they're really more informed than others. That's a better way to put it. There's a gray area as far as intelligence, but people that are intelligent are really just more informed. They have more tools to think. They're not just blindly more intelligent. That's a myth. So let me continue. The question reads, given that some people are simply more intelligent than others, the suggestions of the more or even vastly more intelligent people will be considered by the computer all the time, while the less gifted people's, in other words, let me correct this, less gifted people's meaning less informed people's, while the less gifted people's suggestions will have no effect. Could this not potentially lead to a class society where less intelligent people feel left out and maybe make them wish for something like a one-man vote system, even if they too benefit from the ideas of the most intelligent ones? I hope everyone followed that. What he's asking is those that are aware and that have information, that have been educated, that are informed, will naturally have a higher propensity to get things through the system than those that are not. And that is actually the beauty of the system. As opposed to all of the erroneous opinion of people that will say, for the general example I used in the presentation, if you read one page or a few pages of a book, you can form an opinion on that book. However, if you read the entire thing, well, I would say that the person that reads the entire thing should have a much more valued opinion than the guy that just read a few pages. And that metaphor can be applied to awareness of culture and technology and science as a whole. So when people interact in this system, it will naturally weed out those that don't have enough information to participate. For example, someone might not be aware of a specific technology that's in development or that exists, and what they'll do is they'll go to the system and they'll submit their concepts, and the system will respond to them by saying, we've already done that. We use this material, and in 2010, and it will clarify that. And then if someone proposes something that hasn't been fully thought out, such as a material that can't withstand a certain dynamic or environmental condition based on the usage of the product they're presenting, the computerized system will immediately understand the physics of these materials, and it will suggest a better one, or it will decline the idea, or it's not necessarily, first of all, we're speaking too far ahead because these systems aren't implemented yet, but nevertheless, the response of the program will be to correct what you're doing, and some people won't have anything original to say. They won't have anything new. They won't have anything creative because they're not informed enough to make that type of creative introduction. They're not informed enough to make something new. That's a really good thing because it's reducing all of the noise that we see from people that haven't bothered to learn a specific field thoroughly, so they just project out their assumptions based on the limited information that they have. And on a second level, it's wonderful because it motivates people to be educated. If people want to contribute, say, in the aviation industry, they're going to have to learn a lot in order to input something into the system that will be validated because of the integrity of the idea. The integrity would have to be validated because of the science that's been incorporated into the program that can reference it. And by the way, these program orientations are not fiction. You see this a lot. There's all sorts of developments that have been happening that I'm going to feature in the new film that talk about this exact concept, and it's being used. I mean, even in the cancer industry, there are people that have been creating complex program systems where they put blood in, and with an incredible degree of accuracy, the programs have been able to pinpoint things that humans could never do in a lab as well in the past. So program decision-making processes is growing rapidly. It's going to be very much commonplace in a segregated way. What we want is to combine them all together. So I hope that clarifies that. It's a very good thing, and this is what will motivate people to be more educated because they can contribute to society if they understand the processes. If they don't, then naturally they can't contribute. I mean, I don't say that in a way that means they're restricted. They have to learn. I mean, it's not that they have to learn some specific idea. They just have to learn science and technology, and that's not an opinion. So I hope that's clear. It's a touchy frame of reference for those that want to misinterpret words, but nevertheless. Number 2, can you offer us some advice on how you would approach the subject with somebody who is hearing about it for the first time, a resource-based economy? Well, I think the first thing you'd want to point out is the current economic state of affairs. So if you find somebody that's upset about the current economic state of affairs, you run with that. And then you begin to make suggestions. You don't tell them anything. What you do is you say, I heard about this idea. I heard about it from somebody. Heard about it from a friend or my father. And you say, what do you think of this idea? And ask their opinion when you give them a general association. What would the general association be? You say that you're involved in a movement that wants to maximize technology for the benefit of all and to the effect of creating an abundance which can be accomplished through resource management and technological ingenuity. And then from there, they'll get interested. You can give examples such as automation plants, everything that people see today, and you explain to them that this could be applied and multiplied everywhere in society. And then you go one tier more and you say, you notice how money has been restricting this because of the need for self-preservation and all the things that we've talked about before. I don't want to go into the whole spiel because it is long-winded. The activist orientation guide, the 83-page guide, is a great thing. Once you get someone curious, don't try to kill yourself by trying to explain it and reading into what they might project at you. Try to give them the information that they can read on their own accord. It's the best tool, I think, to leave it to themselves, not to feel like someone's telling them. There's a ego issue, I think, that comes about very often when you engage in new information with people. Number 3, Peter, you have been talking about people veering away from the Zeitgeist Movement and the Venus Project's ideas. Some slightly and others are more blatantly doing their own thing. What is your opinion on this? Well, at this stage, people need to kind of come back to the home base of the Venus Project, and they can't go too far with their own concepts, and especially in regards to the broadest possibilities. For example, some people have misinterpreted the idea of the first city as being something of a commune. That's not the way it should be. The first city should not be a place where people just live. The first city is actually going to be a research center that's open to the public of the world. It's going to have research that's going on. It's also going to be an expo as such, I'm not sure what the term actually I would use for that, but it's going to be a display center for all nations and all peoples to come and see what the future could be. It's sort of a science museum of the future. I can't think of a better way to describe it, but it would be interactive. It would be big. It would be something that people do live there, but very few. Only those that live there would be the ones that are engaged in massive contributions on the technological advancement of it to develop it as a whole. I say that generally speaking. So things like that. So I see people out there trying to create communities, and they're not really doing what needs to be done. This has to spread internationally. It can't just be a restricted thing. The first city can't be just a happy community and somehow it's all self-sustaining. That's actually quite dangerous, because that's going to attract a strange perception. And within the monetary system, if you're not working to expand it to really overcome the limits of the monetary system, you're gonna get all sorts of propaganda publicity, just like any commune. You're going to get people that don't like it. You're going to probably get monetary collusions to the effect where certain military establishments might come against it. There's all sorts of problems that could emerge. This has to be open. So I hope that's clear. People need to keep coming back to the home base at this point. There's not enough information out there for people to go on their own accord. I'm really trying to trust people. That's why, for example, on the Gateway page, I have these international sites recognized. Some of the sites I can't read everything on it, but it looks like they're doing good work, and the people I've spoken with seem to be very honest. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. So I think it's great what people are doing. They're excited about things, but we have to be careful not to deviate too far. And of course, misinterpretations are quite transparent. But I hope that answers your question. It's complex. Number 4, do you think meat in vitro or produced in a laboratory can replace the animal meat? Jacques stated in an interview that in the future we will be able to produce food without killing animals. Yes, you can assess. You can create chemical mechanisms that can put the protein strains together and can create, basically grow anything in a chemical processes if it was perfected. There are in vitro projects that have been done with apparently some decent success, even though it hasn't been commercialized, and you can kind of imagine why, because of the establishment. And on a different level, when you get into molecular engineering, it will become even more easy. So I absolutely believe that. I see no reason why that can't happen. And for vegetarians out there, I think this is a great resolve for people that have an emotional issue with the slaughter, and of course the absolute inhumane treatment we do with animals, which is worth recognizing. Eventually, I think we can bypass the killing of organisms and instead cultivate virtually everything. I see that as a growing reality by all means, and then the means for abundance too, which is another reason why we should be focusing on such methods. Number 5, I remember you once saying how things like television and video games are being used by people to relax and forget about their day jobs. So I was wondering, what kind of entertainment will there be in the Venus Project? Will there be things like video games and TV? Well, I don't see any reason why not. People can entertain themselves as their conditioning allows. The interesting thing is that all entertainment will not be for profit. Therefore, certain reinforcements will naturally fade. If you have a television show that's taking on patterns of conflict that they know the audience will be attracted to, they perpetuate that and they don't deviate from it because of the maintaining of the profit system. In other words, every film you see has the same general plots. We glorify guns, we glorify violence and war, and it's a self-generating mechanism because for some reason people are still excited by these things in a very primitive way. I think that the hope is that we will move, and I can't answer this question because I can't see that far ahead. Naturally, the cultural value of the media that's produced will serve a function. It won't just be wasting time. I have to say, to a certain degree, most people who play violent video games, I have friends that play stuff like that, they don't take it seriously. It's not like they want to go out and shoot people. But then again, there are some people that have mental distortions and bad cultural experiences, and they can't separate fact from fiction. and they do develop these weird propensities and obsessions with weapons. You see this in the media. Years ago, we had sort of the onslaught of this kind of high bling, violent culture with people on television walking around with guns and with lots of money, and you had this perpetuation of basically the most base level of the system, that base level of society you can think of. And it, of course, it lured in a lot of people. We need to reverse that, and it's my hope that people like us will start creating video games and programs that will begin to culture people differently, so they get out of these just primitive, sick systems of relationship, these reference that only, they don't help anything. They just don't help anything. So I hope that answers your question. It's a tough question. I think in time things will become much more, they'll have a point. It won't just be to amuse people based and perpetuate their own aberrancies that they have been cyclically conditioned into. It will evolve and people will change. You'll see a great diversity. There's very little diversity out there as far as media. I'm sure you guys recognize that. Number 6, if everything told about us is just learned along the way, like you're told to be achieving or not, or good or bad, therefore we are spiritual beings, the experiencers who rely on personal spiritual growth and secondary on growth of everything around us. Hold on, let me try to decipher this. How can you understand what's happening around you if you don't even know yourself? Well, there's a lot of interesting terminology you're using there that I can't say I readily can understand what you're saying. If you understand that you're a product of your culture, if you're willing to forego the ego and look at yourself as an extension of the world that you live in, you're a cultivated organism, once you do that, you begin to overcome a lot of issues. That's sort of how you know yourself. Once you realize that all that religious propaganda that you were fed in, that was fed into you as a child, say in your upbringing, was learned, and those emotional developments were developed inside of you, those identifications, once you understand that, you can more readily overcome them. So I hope that answers your question. You can't understand yourself without understanding the world that created you. So, number 7, I came across this article called Canadian ISPs Plan Net Censorship. Wouldn't that pretty much destroy the movement, since the internet is the biggest way to spread the word? Well, I'm keeping one eye on all of the internet censorship stuff that's happening, and there's two sides to it. I see it as something that definitely has to be countered when it's developed, and I also see the other side as what they're doing is going to be very difficult, and I'm not saying it can't be done. The internet is growing rapidly. People love it. There's so many things that people can do now. The internet has replaced so many forms of commerce, so many forms of interaction, that for them to start restricting things is going to be met with upheaval. I firmly believe the public won't tolerate that. At least not really. It'd be one thing if I do believe they'll get to a point, and it's be difficult to fight, where say they can shut down the internet in the case of a public emergency, which Obama has already suggested, which I don't agree with. That's one level of it. That might be very difficult to stop, yet people should constantly object to that as well if it happens. That's when you freak out. But as far as the other tiers of making subscription-based services and censorship and partitions, that is, I don't see them getting away with that anytime soon, but we're definitely going to keep our eyes open for that. And as I mentioned in addendum, we have to protect the internet. And if these things start to develop more steadily and they get support, then you'll definitely see the movement react. Number 8, with the transition of the Venus Project, there would still be jobs that require some amount of human labor. Because automation would not be instantaneously ubiquitous, there would probably be people who would refuse to perform dirty, boring jobs while everyone else is becoming a doctor or an artist. How do we determine who has to perform these duties? I think you're jumping ahead and confusing some issues a little bit. The first jobs that would be automated are, of course, the most boring and the dirty ones. This has already been happening in our culture. From factories where people just sticking heads on dolls, you don't see that anymore. Machines are doing this. You get machines to clean out sewers. You get machines to pick up garbage. I don't see any reason why that can't be automated now. It takes the conscious shift of the culture to want to do that, and that's really the issue. So there will always be things that in transition people are going to have to do, and as time moves forward, less and less people are needed. I think the moment the culture decides to do this, it'll be a pretty dramatic jump. It won't just be like one day It won't be a step-by-step process. It'll be a dramatic shift where you're going to have a lot of people that instantly have a lot more time. And ultimately, the real issue comes down to where people's value systems are as far as how they contribute to society. To a lot of people, the difference between what you call a boring job and somebody else being an artist isn't that different. They don't have those distinctions. I meet people all the time that claim to like their very monotonous job. They've conditioned themselves, as far as I'm concerned, for their own emotional sanctity, for their own sanity, to bullshit themselves that they like what they're doing, because if they didn't, it would cause depression and everything else. So I think that it's a complex question. I don't see it as an issue. I think there will be, as time moves forward, there'll be less and less people required to operate the systems. And therefore, I believe out of the pool of people, there'll be plenty of people that feel reward and they feel that, they feel the reward of the volunteerism. They know that they're contributing, and it comes back to them as well. And they will do it. I'm certainly one of them. I think many of you out there are. In the words of Margaret Mead, most of the most rewarding things, the most rewarding things that people seem to enjoy are the ones that are not associated with money or profit. They're associated with helping people, and this is the value system I think that will emerge. Number 9, why can't there be a fully open source voting system instead of a computer that determines the right choice? The right choice. Even though computers can process and calculate more information than a human, there would need to be a final human say in the outcome of a project or request. Instead, could we have a multitude of polls available to everyone electronically in real time with a fraud-proof system similar to a forum poll? That's a very interesting question. The first point I'd like to make is, what are we voting on? In a system without the noise that we have in our current system, without the monetary system, many of the issues that people today vote on are not going to exist. People are really obsessed with money and the organization of money and taxes. Why do you think all politicians use the tax thing every single time? They always talk about taxes because that's what pulls people in. People don't want to pay more money, so they'll vote for people that support their current tax bracket. The real rich will support those that tax the middle class more than the wealthy, and of course the poor will support those that tax the wealthy more than the middle class, even though it hasn't really worked out that way, interestingly enough. You'd think that, well, I'm not going to go on that tangent. Nevertheless, in the new system, voting it comes down to the inferential logic of the developments. For example, if you want to have a bridge, say someone, do you want to vote on the bridge? If you have a need to go from point A to point B, does it really require people to vote on it? I mean, really? If people have a necessity, if more than one person has a necessity, I'll put it that way, it would seem to me that would be pretty transparent to people. It serves a function. If you have a resource on one side and you need to get it to another, you have to have something to get it from point A to point B. Let's assume that you did want to vote on that. Let's just say hypothetically, and there was a vote and it was approved. Do you stop voting there? Why don't you vote on the rivets? Why don't you vote on the type of metal used? Why don't you vote on the architectural structure? Why don't you vote on all of the physical components? Why? Because most people recognize that as a natural scientific unfolding. So you use the best materials, you use the best forms of physical analysis, physics, and you develop the best bridge you can with the techniques that are known right then. Most people stop their voting regimen there because it seems irrational to vote on every little thing. And this can work in an inferential sense in reverse of what I've just described. Obviously, if you have a need to go from point A to point B, you build the bridge. So why vote to begin with? You know what I mean? It's a difficult point because people can't think that way. And that's what Jacques means when he talks about arriving at decisions. Utility and necessity are what create the need for any particular thing. In our current system, we have war, we have taxes, we have all this noise that is meaningless. So people vote on things that are absolutely relevant to society. No one's voting on the management of the natural resources. Have you noticed that? There's nothing like that going on. People vote because everything's in conflict. Voting is just another form of warfare. So in the new system, none of those attributes are supported. So voting, the real issue is consensus, the consensus of what goods you want. So public consensus will emerge in some fashion, which perhaps could come in the form of a forum poll. That's absolutely rational, I suppose, even though I can think of other ways it can materialize. But people would say, well, I want this, and I'm going to submit it to the system, and it's going to be provided for them and made available to everyone else if the statistical consensus is there. I hope that makes sense. The voting notion is really outdated. It's not needed when you start to orient society based on what's actually relevant and what's real. Now, what were the other points that you stated here? I think that's it. I think that covers most of it. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the idea of choice is blown out of proportion in our current society because we're all at war with each other. If we all worked in a system that was designed to take care of all of us with our contributions equally helping everyone else, you're going to see an entirely different perspective of participation in government and so-called government and things like that. So I hope that answers your question. Number 10, do you advocate the use of politics to further our goals as a means to an end? For example, it's actually viable in some countries to create new political parties to help with our agenda, or do you think we should denounce the use of politics completely? You know, in the broadest scheme, I believe that denouncing politics is important, but no doors are closed as far as interaction. We still live in this system, and we still have to gauge the transition. I don't believe we should have a Venus Project or Zeitgeist political party, even though I considered that in the past. It's more to the effect as we need to begin putting pressure on those that are currently in the establishment. Who knows the ways things will develop in the future, but I can't say I really can relate to that question. Excuse me. I can't say I can really answer that question definitively. Obviously, there has to be some interaction with the political structure, but generally speaking, I think a mass movement is much more relevant. And once that mass movement is apparent, the politicians will have to simply step back and allow the will of the people to emerge. That's the real pressure. It isn't going to be sitting down with politicians individually and negotiating. I don't feel that the reinforcement of our culture is so aberrated that it's not going to work like that. It's not going to work in the sense that we assume politics unfolds. I just can't imagine, and I could be wrong on that, but I'm just going to state that assumption. You guys can consider it. But yes, the idea is to transcend politics. So we have to the means is the end in my mind. I really believe that. I really don't like underhanded tactics. I think that people need to become the change, as Gandhi would put it. If everyone begins to think in the same way, then that information is going to travel and change will happen. But if people continue to harp on the system and continue to try to work within the system, even though we have to do that to a certain degree, unfortunately, that's just going to perpetuate the system. So it's a conflict there, an unfortunate one. Number 11, is the end goal to eliminate, or as much as possible, the ego? Well, that's an interesting question. Ego, I think, is synonymous with superiority on a certain level. I'd say, generally speaking, yes. I mean, we want people to not have an inclination to think they're better than anybody else. There really is no basis for anyone to think they're better than anyone else if you understand how information is transferred and how ideas are created. It's really removing the reinforcement for narrow self-interest, I would say, other than the term ego. If people, and it's also educating them about the symbiotic relationship of reality. Once people understand their interconnectivity, once you understand that we can't abuse the environment that supports us, the ego element begins to dwindle. In fact, we should be generally very humble, so to speak, in regard to everything, because there's so much that we don't know. Anyone who's egotistical is definitely aberrant. I don't even need to say that. But nevertheless, do we go after ego per se? Yes and no. That term has many different counter meanings. It's not as simplistic as just going after the ego. There are other elements there that create the ego that have to be gone after first. But as far as your general question, yes, I'd say generally speaking, that is one of the goals. Number 12, I understand that reward for helping contribute to the environment is that in turn you are helping yourself as well as others. But will recognition for ideas, innovations, etc. still be important? Well, again, that carries over from the ego question. I really hope not. First of all, it's illogical. No one person invents anything. It is a gradual evolutionary process. Einstein didn't off the top of his head invent the theory of relativity. It was a buildup of grand science that he had studied throughout his life. Newton didn't magically come up with the theory of gravity. And what's going to happen is people perfect on that too. In fact, there's a great train of thought right there. You had Newton, who is, that discovers gravity. Not really. He was able to put it together while the people that he studied were not. And then Einstein picked up sort of where Newton left off, and he altered certain physical laws that Newton thought were true. And this process is ongoing. We will always work in a continuous line. Everything is interconnected as far as knowledge. So, people that want recognition don't understand that. And I think if you explain that to them, they'll begin to be embarrassed by their feelings. And and it goes it relates to the monetary system as well. It's pretty much the exact same thing. You say, I did this, therefore I get the reward. And even if it's not for monetary payment after a certain point, you just want the recognition. And, very often, even if it's not for monetary reward, the recognition sticks and it's used for monetary purposes after the fact. You know what I mean? So I think, I hope that people will grow out of that. I certainly don't see a reason for everyone to want to claim recognition for all their ideas. It's illogical. Number 13, if I were to write a book, do you think concepts such as fantasy would be something of the past, considered a waste of time or unproductive? I only say this because on the past radio show, I'm fairly sure I heard someone say that Disney stories and fairy tales would have no place. I believe it was Fresco that mentioned that people at a young age, children, are given fantasies early on. And psychologists and sociologists will tell you that this is to inspire creativity in the youth. And while that might be true, I happen to agree with Fresco that it causes much more damage because it implants bizarre notions of reality. Reality is amazing. There's so many mystical things, so to speak, that go on, natural phenomenon, physically, weird things. When you begin to study science, just seeing with the magnets fascinate me. You give kids these types of tools at a young age, and they can learn very rapidly about the natural world. I believe that's much more powerful. And naturally, as they grow older, they will have a much more solidified basis of reality if they have that at a younger age. If you give kids myth and religion and Disney stories and Barbie dolls at a young age, all you're doing is distorting them, and you're creating a propensity for them to perpetuate social distortions as they get older. I believe generally speaking, Santa Claus kids grow out of. But is there really a difference when a kid is taught Santa Claus or a kid is taught about God? Is there really a difference there? One is simply perpetuated, and the other one is considered a fantasy and left. So I hope that association is clear. I agree with Fresco. Kids should not be learning all this nonsense at a young age. Kids can learn very rapidly. As most of you know, kids at a young age can learn languages extremely fast. This is really where a lot of the focus should be as far as education, is really getting kids at a young age to understand important aspects of reality and the natural world and human interaction. And it's usually the impression of the youngest ages that carries through time. The kids that are beaten up really young or abused, this stuff carries. So, I think kids are treated very, very poorly, or educated very poorly in our current system. Number 14, in the future, I imagine that most people will be able to live harmoniously and most aberrant behavior can be addressed through education. However, I wonder if the system would be susceptible to crimes of passion, such as jealousy over a relationship. I believe I've covered that one before, So you have a guy who breaks up with his girlfriend, he sees the girl with some other guy and runs up to the guy and punches him, even though it has nothing to do with that guy. This is a cultural sickness, and I think this will fade through time because we'll grow out of so many of the weird cultural institutions that have been developed. I happen to think that I think Jacques pointed this out to me, that the ownership notion of men and women, my wife, my husband, these are really come from a weird form of monetary extrapolation. It's weird historically how men have been dominant and they own women, and in fact they literally owned women at a certain point in time. You have polygamists, you have people with lots of wives. There's an obvious weird thing happening there that needs to be grown out of, at least in the sense of relationships of ownership or any type of stratification of human beings, so to speak. Sadly, this is still prevalent in certain cultures. So anyway, it has to be grown out of. So yes, in the transition, yes, crimes of passion will probably definitely occur just as they do now. In relationship to all of the other problems we have today, they will be quite minimal. And I think through time it will get to a point where murders and things like this are so rare that you really won't even need to have a police force. They will just be so rare that people, the community will react, and it will be dealt with at a social level. But in the transition, those things will occur, and I do believe education will overcome them as well. excuse me, number 15, I was wondering what the best argument for the Zeitgeist Movement Venus Project is on the matter of incentive. It would be nice to have an argument that would click in people's minds. Also, how do I explain to people that this notion is not being brainwashed? Well, the notion of incentive, as I've said before, is really living well and having a society that supports you. No crime, no debt, extreme less stress. Getting what you need, you grow, you explore, you develop, you flourish. That is the incentive. Unfortunately, people can't even see that. As far as brainwashing, everything is brainwashing. I hope everyone understands that. Obviously, you can redefine brainwashing as being sort of a forced element for the sake of some other party that has no personal benefit. So if you're brainwashed to do something like MK Ultra, the old U.S. government brainwashing thing that went on for about 70 years, where they would take people and they would inject them with crazy drugs and feed LSD to them for 99 days straight and play loud, screaming music in their ears, trying to erase their brains. Who knows what they accomplished? I'm terrified to see the documents about what they actually accomplished, because I do believe personally that they have created Manchurian candidates, but that's for another subject. Everyone's brainwashed, one way or another. It's either you're brainwashed for good or you're brainwashed for bad. We'll use a better term in conditioning. What you're doing is educating people, and they use the tools they have to think for themselves, whatever that means. And, I think through time, people will have the tools to recognize enough natural phenomenon, have enough feedback from the environment to listen to what you're saying, take it in, and, quote, understand it and relate to it and identify with it, because there is a feedback mechanism from the environment that is supporting that, and therefore the conditioning becomes viable. So I hope that makes sense. Number 16, how do you persuade the world to switch to the Venus Project? Our current society fears change, and religious and corporate giants will tear this down through the media. Obviously, that will definitely be the case. How do we switch? We have to slowly march through with educating people and creating a research city to show the world what can be done. We have to begin to change the culture. That's basically it. I think patterns of change are a good thing to think about. We've come from so many extremely negative, aberrant aspects of society that if you look at society today, we're certainly better than we were before, I'd say, generally speaking, from the outrageous racism that occurred, 60, 70 years ago. Everyone was almost racist back then. All my older relatives had notions of racism in certain levels. I hear in passing, they got over it, and they change. Everything changes. So you have to kind of recognize that and have confidence that these changes will continue, and I certainly have that confidence and believe in it. So, and of course, act upon it. Number 17, with the communication team, would it be possible not to simply present the ideas of the movement in the Venus Project, but also somehow lead or direct those interested into studying the information to become not just a communicator, but a teacher also? Well, you know what? All communication is basically teaching on a certain level. If you're talking to somebody, you're setting up ideas for them, and they're listening to you, and they're learning from you, whether it's tangible or relevant. That's a different story. So I'm not quite sure what you mean. The point I would make is between critical thinking and rote learning, people need to learn how to think. So what I would say is, instead of just telling people statistics and things like that, explain to them processes. Explain to them the logic of the system, because many people will come at you and say, hey, this is communism. And you say, well, why is it communism? And then they'll give you a definition because it's Marxist, because Marx rejected profit. And then you say, well, so anything that rejects profit is communism? And you break down the argument, and then you build it up from a different direction. For instance, you say, well, if you look at history, everything that that really benefits us is technological. And technology has been developing constantly. So let's acknowledge this pattern of technology and look at where it can go, and now look at current science ideas of science that seem extremely fanciful and science fiction to people, but do have a sound basis. What is it going to mean to society when we do have nanotechnology that can materialize matter through molecular engineering? What's that going to mean? It's going to mean that the capitalist system is a joke. You can't have a system like that anymore. And if you get them to think about that critically, the train of thought, as opposed to just singular points, you'll have a lot of luck. So I guess that's what you mean by teaching, giving them the processes of inference that are relevant. Number 18, How many years do you think it will take before the transition into a resource-based economy begins? I really have no idea. I don't have enough information to make that decision, to make an educated guess. I do think that we have a lot of trouble ahead. The ecological crises are growing, and biosocial pressures, the worse things become, as much as I hate to say it, the larger the probability for change if people are educated on the new direction. So the economic crisis is, of course, a big one, but sadly most people think we're just going to pull out of it again, and they accept it, and they are waiting for the other boom period of this massive bust. I think that the biosocial pressures are going to reveal that, and I really couldn't tell you. I do hope it happens, something substantial happens within the next 10 to 25 years, because if the patterns that are currently emerging continue, we're going to be in some serious trouble ecologically. I mean, forget the economic stuff. That's all nonsense. Economics is nonsense. We're destroying the resources of the planet and our environment. Number 19, how would a central computer scale the priorities of the environment and humans? That's an interesting question. I would have to say it would be based on technological necessity and extrapolations of consumption patterns of people. For example, if we run out of iron ore, first of all, the idea would be not to run out of it. It would be to create a system that's in checks and balances to not allow the extinction of a particular mineral. And if it is seen that such a mineral is in the process of being used up, then the system automatically begins to address substitutes. And substitutes are very important. Substitutes, we have so many possibilities of substitutes. You know, people say we're running out of topsoil. Excuse me, we are running out of topsoil. And people say, we're going to run out of arable land area. What are we going to do? And they run around. They have no idea that we have other technologies such as hydroponic agriculture or soilless agriculture that can take the place of that. So that's how I guess when you say scaling the priorities, that's how it would work for the environmental management. As far as people and consumption patterns are based on statistical models. That's pretty easy to do, as I think I mentioned before. So people submit to the system, you get a consensus of what people want, what their contributions are, and in time, technology will get to a point where people can custom manufacture things. You don't have to have a factory mass produce for the sake of the integrity of. For example, today it's quite a bit of labor to build a machine and to make it build a certain thing very efficiently. And it can only build that one particular thing without too much variance. In time, I think machines will be much more malleable, and you'll be able to have machines that can do custom jobs through programming. And I think this already slightly exists in certain ways. But so when someone wants something, they customize it on, say, the internet, and it's sent to them as a custom job. And there's only one made, and it can be made like that. It can be done like that. It's not scarce either because the system can reproduce it. So I hope that makes sense as far as priority. Number 20, do you foresee the physical transition to these concepts being completed one country at a time? I don't know, but I would say most likely. I would say if you get a country that has the courage enough to engage in this type of system, at least on a certain technical level, all countries are going to be restricted by the monetary system. If everybody else is using the monetary system, and there's one country that doesn't, well, we saw what happened in other communities that attempted social concepts. And I can assure you there's a CIA wing that deals with just this issue. I mean, they destroy countercultures because they're a threat to the dominant culture. It's just self-preservation 101, and it's based on the monetary system. So, yes, I think most likely, I would hope that it would kind of be a natural gravitation where you'd have different research facilities built in many different countries. They're not necessarily communities, and suddenly, over time, they begin to multiply and the communities begin to develop. So if it's just one country, I don't know. I worry about stuff like that, but I don't have the answer to that. I'm sorry. Oh, and there's a second part to this question. If yes, where would it make sense to start geographically and why? Well, generally speaking, any place with the most resources that doesn't need to import lots of other resources for survival would be great. And if their political system is social too, then that would help. I firmly don't think this is going to start in the United States. The U.S. is just, it's really terrible what the U.S. has turned into and the power that it holds and it seeks to dominate. So I think it would start in a poorer, more socialist country, frankly, one with a leader that's open-minded, that is probably suffering to a certain degree and wants to see something new for his people. Again, all governments are basically corrupt. We can only hope that eventually people will come through with the understanding of this, and you will see it begin to implement. Number 21, to date, have certain countries expressed interest in these concepts? Which ones and how much? There have been some countries that have, well, actually some people in certain countries that have offered land to the Venus Project, but this is all up in the air. I can't say anything definitively. These people just suggest things, but I'm hoping that one of these will eventually stick, and we'll find out. It's basically whoever wants to start doing it, really. We can't pick and choose. We need to get the research center implemented and get the thing, the thing feeling tangible to people, where it's not just a concept. Number 22, is the Venus Project only possible if we all trust one another to share and distribute things fairly? That's a very interesting question. There's always a degree of trust. I mean, I trust the scientific method because there's a feedback mechanism that comes from the environment. I mean, how do we develop trust of any type of anything? It's through feedback. Now, I don't confuse trust with faith. Faith is very different. Faith is a rejection of feedback. So people mix these terms up semantically. I have, say for example, and this is a little bit of deviation from your point, but I think it's important to express. If I have a history of, if I experience fire and I throw water on that fire and it goes out, and I do this in many different areas, then I'm going to develop a trust that water puts out fire in all circumstances. It would seem relevant historically. But say I encounter a oil fire, and I throw the water on the oil fire and it just slips straight through and it spreads the fire, then I've learned something. The environment has fed back to me that there's a problem with my original hypotheses. And this is an ongoing development in all walks. So when it comes to trust, we should trust the methods that have given us the best results. And I think, yes. I mean, as far as people, trusting people, that's a psychological issue. If the system that we're in is based on relevance, in other words, it's based on things that are tangible and not the nonsense we live in today, the culture that will emerge will have trust for the system as well, I believe. I don't see why they wouldn't. And therefore the interrelationship of trust between people would be inherent. That's a complex question. As far as the distribution, people aren't just going to sit there and decide who gets what. The systems do that, and it's based on statistical models. So, the fair, trust and fair thing, those aren't really relevant questions. It's not really the correct question. The difference is that the system will not reward the type of greed-based corruption we see today. Therefore, there's no reason for people to engage in such things where people will question the trust or need fairness. So I hope that makes sense. And that's down the line. There'll be problems in the transition naturally, as with anything. Number 23, it is important to emphasize the role of trust as it relates to personal freedom through the movement. Is it important to emphasize the role of trust? Well, I think I just stated that in the way that I did as far as the fruits of science and the methods. So I don't say trust, though. Trust is a mixed-up word. You take the feedback and you value the feedback and you have a probabilistic perception. Let's put it that way. You gauge things from a probabilistic perception and you act accordingly based on what's of the highest probability. And you have faith and you have an openness. So if something you've done is proven wrong, you absorb that, you're not stubborn about it, and you alter accordingly. And then you adjust your trust, if you will, or you basically adjust your probabilistic assumptions. Number 24, the values that would result from the implementation of the Venus Project would allow for the transformation of human behavior towards sanity. Well, that's an interesting statement. How can we prove that these saner people would have a higher propensity towards happiness? Well, I think you sort of answered your question a little bit yourself. Well, all you have to do is look at history and the suffering that people have gone through, and you can see the obvious cause and effect basis of it. If people are in debt and they're resisting in scarcity and they're malnourished, naturally they're probably not going to feel very good and they're probably not going to be happy and they're going to be forced into the slave labor system because of their debt and they're going to be unhealthy and not feel good. So I can't sit there and generalize that everyone would be happy. This isn't a utopia. There will always be things that conflict with people's happiness. I hope you understand what I mean. We're going for a very broad scheme and then we can fine tune as things go. We still have to get the fundamentals down. And I think once people aren't scared of each other, once people can walk down the street and not worry about being mugged, I mean, imagine that. I live in New York. I see this type of behavior, and just imagine that. That in and of itself will really change society, and people will be so much more amiable and enlightened, and they'll have a totally different perception of each other. And there's a second part of this question. 24B, has an experiment of what life would be like in this new society been designed? Experiment. Well, I believe that Mr. Fresco's experience on the Polynesian islands was a great example of this, because he got to experience what would be termed a resource-based economy in a microcosm. So I believe that in a lot of ways, the simpler societies are the more advanced. Not to say we have to live that way. I think we can use technology and have a very advanced society, but yet still maintain the fundamental principles of a resource-based economy as seen in indigenous cultures who don't even know what property is. So I think it's a very interesting angle. So yes, and the other angle of that is, the experiment really is the research center that we want to build. Number 25, according to the Venus Project theory, humans need to align themselves with natural processes in order to ensure that our new societal emergence is symbiotic. Being that the society we are advocating would be invented from human ingenuity, is natural emergence within this system actually possible? Well, absolutely. I mean, everything, you can't stop the emergence as far as I'm concerned. There's always going to be knowledge that's created through feedback from the environment, and there's always going to be humans expanding ability through inferential logic. So I think, I'm not quite sure I understand what you're asking. I mean, human ingenuity will naturally gravitate towards emergence. I think knowledge is going to always be created, updated, outdated. So I hope that answers your question. Number 26, is there a line in the sand, so to speak, where something goes from natural to unnatural? Well, I guess you could argue that everything is natural. I mean, even the most synthetic creation comes from a natural processes in some way, even if it's humans doing it in a lab. So semantically, those are strange words. I think it really just comes down to the result. If you have a processes that does something, it could be even a natural processes, but it's detrimental. A so-called natural processes like an environmental disaster. It's detrimental. I think it might be a natural idea to say regulate the weather to stop a certain natural phenomenon from injuring societies such as hurricanes or earthquakes, or create elaborate sensor systems to avoid so-called natural processes. Of course, you'd have to gauge all negative retroactions and anything like that, especially if you're going to try and stop earthquakes. I don't know if it's the science that does that, but at least we can monitor it. But who knows what we could do in the future as far as relieving pressure from the earth. There might be a way to actually do that. So the line in the sand is what works, and what over time has proven to be detrimental. So I hope that's simplistic enough, I think. And he continues on 26C. My wife and I had a child 4 weeks ago via a C-section. In the eyes of the Venus Project, would this surgical procedure be considered a good use of current technological understanding, or would it be viewed as an example of abandonment of the abandonment of natural processes? Well, that comes down to necessity. I mean, obviously, I'd say the technological need would be there if the C-section was required. I think that's a pretty simple thing to be concerned with. I'm not going to go into graphic detail as far as childbirth, but obviously there's a reason for people having C-sections. It's usually very, very needed. It's not just a choice, even though I'm sure there's a choice aspect there too. No, I think returning to natural processes in the sense of understanding what's real and relevant, understanding physics and natural phenomenon, understanding that we don't need the noise of the system is extremely important, but there's a poetry there that in many ways people might look at the future society and say it's completely unnatural because their definition of nature might be something absolutely different than, say, seeing self-automated plants that are producing machines that produce more machines that produce everything that the society provides. Someone might call that unnatural. So the whole thing is lost in semantics. Technology is a natural culmination. Number 27, Peter, who is going to program the cybernetic systems? Is there going to be a technological consensus initially? Well, obviously, people will begin the process. But again, it's a technical process, and in time, I believe these machines, through artificial intelligence, will begin to update themselves. You'll have the database of the city connected to all research centers, so when a discovery is made, it instantly goes into the system. Will there be errors and things like that? Probably through time, but they'll be overcome. And as time moves forward, those errors will be greatly diminished. So, yes, it's not the technological consensus. I think it will be self-generated through time. But again, people will begin it, that's for sure. 28. There are great places to live, and there are not so great places. For example, on a cliff above a perfect beach, These kinds of places would be very popular, and not everyone would be able to live there. I understand that different people have different ideas of what constitutes a perfect place to live, but nevertheless, I foresee difficulties and the potential for competition, corruption, and abuse of power in order to obtain whatever an individual would consider a better life. What are your ideas about this? That's a great question. I've answered this question a few times, and it's really up there with a lot of other, what I'd say, are highly materialistic ego questions, even though I understand where you're coming from. In the monetary system, people try to defend such a notion. They say, well, if you have more money, then you can overcome somebody else and get their property and have that lavish, scarce, rare lifestyle. First of all, I think that when the system is created, people will do a great deal of traveling. I would love to see the people not really even having a home. Imagine that. Imagine the planet being your home. Imagine a new value system where people want to learn and change, and people move around, and no one just sits there. The reason people sit in a house is because they have a job and they have property. So they have to have a place to protect their property, and they have to have a job, and so they're near their job, so they have to be near their job. I mean, people just can't move around. For one, they can't afford it. And in a new system, people, I think, will travel a lot. The second part that I would, in answer to your question, I would say that we'll have a great deal of freedom as technology advances where we can duplicate certain scenes, where we can, say, create many more environments, say, of houses on cliffs to satisfy people's needs. This isn't a utopia, however. You can't have this fantasy. We have restrictions that are based on the carrying capacity of the Earth. You can't go up to somebody and say, I disagree with the Venus Project because not everyone can have, say, 100,000 acres of land. It's idiotic because, first of all, not everybody on the planet today could have 100,000 acres of land. There isn't enough land there. Maybe in time we'll be able to create newer land masses. I don't know. I think eventually we'll just get off the planet entirely and start terraforming other planets and larger space stations, things like that. I don't feel that's out of the question whatsoever. But nevertheless, there is an inherent restriction as technology moves forward. Yes, we'll overcome those. So you have to understand that. You have to understand at this stage with the billions of people on this planet that people can't just have thousands of acres of land. It just can't work. So for someone to think that is an aberrancy. And it has nothing to do with freedom. It has to do with understanding the world that you live in. So I hope that answers your question. Number 29, how will there ever be a general consensus amongst all the members of the scientific community when even today they seem to contradict themselves in very many areas, such as global warming, quantum physics, and even some aspects of evolution? That's very interesting. I totally agree with that. There's so much vested interest in the system right now that I believe it really kind of comes from ego and money and self-preservation. It seems to me that people that are perpetuating certain ideas, they develop a following. Even if their science is bad, they get funding, and if they get the funding to do it, they create a self-preserving institution. So even if these institutions are wrong, let's assume hypothetically that global warming is wrong. I'm perfectly honest with you, I don't know. But let's assume, you know how much money is behind that institution? Are they just going to roll over and say they're wrong if a scientist comes out and says they are? Another case study is the Cancer Institution, which I've given many examples of. Cancer Institution, as far as I'm concerned, is based on some terrible science as far as the treatment, and there's all sorts of other things that have come forward that are not allowed. So I believe there will be conflicts, but nothing like we see today. I mean, nothing at all like we see today. Will people have respect for new information? There's no respect for new information in the system because there's too much vested interest. Number 30. How will you be able to either control or regulate programmers from allocating certain resources to those that in all reality may not actually need them? I believe I answered this question in a prior question. As I said, the system will be based on larger order statistical models and be derived from population and some form of social consensus about necessity. So, programmers are not really the issue. If there is an issue with a program, I think it could be found pretty easily. It would be very short term, any problems that related from bad programming or, I guess, aberrant programming. I really don't see that as a big issue. Number 31, Peter, have you gotten a chance to look at the straw man conception? Actually, yeah, I have looked at the straw man conception. And I heard about this years and years ago. In fact, it's based on this maritime law concept, which is a very esoteric notion. I got to be perfectly frank. Even though I find it fascinating and interesting, it's still working within the system, and it's still lost in a very esoteric argument. You know, for example, people say, "Oh, your birth certificate's actually a certificate of ownership." Well, of course it is. I mean, do you really need to see your name in capital letters to understand that? There's a strange argument that goes with this, that somehow people think that if they acknowledge the fact that you're basically born into a legal system that defines you legally, and somehow you know about that, and somehow you can get out of it. And while I know I've met some people that call themselves sovereign citizens that claim they don't pay taxes, one thing you have to keep in mind is that you're still working within the system structure, and the people that control the system can change it at will. So it's like a system of doors, and there's certain doors that might be open for a little while, but all it takes is a certain legal position to close those doors, and then you're screwed. I don't believe I've seen any real benefit to the strawman argument as far as it being implemented. I'm sure there's sovereign citizens out there that have told me that they've accomplished certain things. I'd like to see it in proof, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't think people should waste too much time with these types of ideas. You don't need to see. For those of you out there that aren't familiar with this, the strawman concept is that basically when you're born into maritime law. It's a maritime law distinction, loosely speaking, and your birth certificate has names in capital letters. All your social security numbers and everything are in capital letters. And this is evidently a separate distinction from you as a human being. It's your legal entity, and therefore and then they have all these other weird notions that I really can't find any support for, that the human being is the collateral to the bankers, and it gets hyper-conspiratorial. And again, I believe there's a great deal of projection, a great deal of fantasy in some of this. But nevertheless, there is a basis to it that is interesting. I would suggest that you not focus too much on it. I don't see it as a way to help anything, pursuing it and attempting to analyze it, break it down, and overcome it. I think we have much more important work to do than focus on issues like that. Much more productive, in other words. Number 32, Peter, do you know if machines in the future will be able to design music, movies, art in general? I think that maybe they can manage more variables than us and make a better product. Well, I wouldn't really care of machines designing music, movies, and art. I don't see the merit in that per se. I think those are unique human expressions. I think the real point of the machine is to design products, and I think, yes, you can have inferential logic applied to design where, for example, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of this, but many years ago there was a program that was developed which designed a boat, if I remember correctly, and it went through all these patterns of making the most efficient boat, and the boat won this race. You know, and I could be wrong on this. I'm going to stop right there because I have to go back and check that. I should have brought that up. Basically, there are historical precedents of design mechanisms from machines that can come to conclusions through inferential logic that it would take a human a long, long time to do. And yes, when it comes to utility-based engineering, machines will be very, very helpful, and they will be able to go many, many levels above what we understand because they can put things together, they have more resources, and they can think more quickly. So absolutely. In regards to actual design, machines will help in design by all means. In fact, it would not surprise me if they exceed the human's capacity of design almost entirely on larger social structures as well. But that's for another subject. Number 33, are you familiar with the work of Helena Blavatsky, and what is your view of the Theosophical Society? I have no view of the Theosophical Society. I've never read anything by Helena Blavatsky. There's some weird people out there that have been making associations of the movement and the Venus Project of the Theosophical Society, and they're making fictional associations, which I find amusing. I think it sparked from my use of Jiddu Krishnamurti, which I don't know if you guys know. He was adopted by this strange organization, and he was raised as this weird world leader for the Theosophical Society. He disliked it as he got older, and he disbanded. And he wrote some beautiful philosophical works that have nothing to do with the central tenets. Well, have nothing to do with anything but his own ideas. Because I really have no idea what the Theosophical Society is. So anyway, this is a strange thing that's been developed. I'm not sure what you're asking me. If you're relating to the conspiracy notion that's been developed, please, everyone, just ignore that stuff. It's just really annoying. Number 34. A lot of members, including myself, have been eager to know what the current member count is and how fast we are growing. I think it would be a bigger motivation if we could actually see the updated total members. The membership is about 265,000 as far as our site. Then you have the Facebook, which is like 150,000 plus. Then you have the Russian site, which I believe is 5,000 to 8,000. I can't remember now. I have to look. I don't know about all the other international sites. I believe there's so many community groups out there that have participation that they obviously haven't come to the main site, best I can tell. So I really don't know the numbers. I took the thing off because I couldn't get an automatic counter up. I can't get the programming to do that. I should put that back up. Our growth rate is pretty good. It's not what it needs to be. That's why I'm pushing these international sites. We have to get this thing going international. I mean, the majority of the growth rate is in the West, but there's a great amount of interest that's coming from all over the world. So okay, I hope I'll post more numbers as we grow. I'll make a note of that. Number 35. In the books I have been reading by Carl Sagan, he talks a lot about behavior in humans and animals and says that male humans have a much greater testosterone ration than a lot of other animals. And the effects of too much of this hormone causes aggression and territorialism. Do you think this would be a problem do you think this would be a problem in trying to build a new society if there are males who are naturally aggressive and controlling? How would that transcribe if their environment was changed? That's a great question. Another point that is worth thinking about is adrenal glands. Some animals have large adrenal glands, and they're ones that have a much faster temper. They're ones that, for example, you probably remember those two guys, the two magicians that had those trained lions, and they had them for years. And one lion eventually attacked one of the trainers. I don't know exactly what happened, but people will say, oh, that was the instinct. Well, it's actually probably a physiological propensity. Lions have massive adrenal glands, as you can imagine. I mean, they're huge animals. I mean, they're dominant. They're cultivated in the environment to be predators, I guess you could say. It's their evolutionary mechanism that's been created. So the taming of them is only one thing. There are physiological elements that come into play. And I think what it comes down to is that certain people do have physiological propensities, and it isn't as much worrying about, what it is creating an environment that doesn't trigger those types of responses. I think if you raised a tiger as a little kitten in a highly social environment, you would still have the risk of somehow getting the animal angry and reacting violently because it has such a fast reaction through its chemical processes. You can call that genetic, but it is genetic, but it's not genetic in the sense that people use the term instinct in the loose, hyper, glorified geneticist stuff that we have now. Everything is hyper genetic based now. Everyone loves to blame genetics on everything, and as I said before, it's a form of superstition, a form of possession. The physiological propensities that you have pointed out in this question are great. I haven't read Carl Sagan talk about testosterone, but I totally understand what he's talking about. And the trick is not to have an environment that triggers this type of behavior. Propensities are triggered, so that's what I would have to say. If you create an environment that is supporting and doesn't put people in a great deal of stress, then if they have a natural propensity physiologically towards aggressive behavior, they will be much less inclined to engage in that behavior if the system doesn't bring it out of them through all sorts of stress and conflict and problems. So I think that's pretty self-evident. Number 36. Do you think the first resource-based city will be able to function correctly, being we might not be able to have all of the necessary technology and resources due to living in a financial world right now? Well, absolutely. Hold on one second. Absolutely. I mean, there's going to be restrictions as we develop, and that's why funding will have to come through for the research center when we have a plot of land to do it. I mean, this is just one of those things, but we can't let that hinder us. We have to think very strategically about how we do it, and in time, as we overcome the system and resources become the most important aspect, then they will become available. So those are transitional questions. I can't give you definitive answers, but I certainly do see there being an issue with gaining the resources necessary to prove the point that needs to be proved. Number 37, what about Codex Alimentarius? Codex Alimentarius is extremely bizarre and quite scary if they actually are able to implement this. For those of you who don't know, it's a commission for global food regulation that is essentially tied to the United Nations, and it hasn't been, from what I understand, it hasn't been implemented yet, but they're pushing implementation to be applied to all countries that are part of the United Nations. What it is it's a global dictatorship for food regulation by corporations. It's essentially a corporate collusion. Companies like Monsanto are heavily in this. There's all sorts of absolutely bizarre science. Just go to the Codex Alimentarius website and then type it and learn information about it. I have the feeling that they're not going to be able to put this through because it's absolutely insane. Some of the things they're taking off of the insecticide list as far as being dangerous, they're how any scientist could possibly allow that, I have no idea. I mean, things that have been known to be absolutely hideous that were taken off the market years ago, these people in Codex Alimentarius are trying to bring it back. And they're doing it because of profit. Who knows? I mean, it's absolutely crazy what they're doing. And I'm looking at that out of the corner of my eye, and if it begins to go forward, then we'll definitely react. And I think a lot of people will react because it's like nothing that's ever gone before as far as regimentation and bad science. Number 38, as a content creator and an advocate for a resource-based economy, what is your perspective of pirating? Would DM Murdoch or Jacques Fresco condone torrent sites? I condone torrent sites, but we still live in a monetary system. I really believe, I think in the same question they had something posted by DM Murdoch where she states she doesn't want people to pirate her work. And you know what? She has a viable point because I know her. She's not wealthy at all. She has to survive, and she doesn't make much money in her books, like most authors really don't. Same goes for the Venus Project. The films. Luckily, people still support loosely, scarcely, but I'm still getting support with the films, even though I have the films available for torrent download. So support is always good, but we still live in a monetary system. Pirating, I think the future will be torrent sites for all information because it's a great way to parse things and download things quickly. You'll have a massive database where you can download everything and anything. That will be the future, but it really comes down to the person that you're pirating information from. If they don't want to be pirated, it's going to have to do with money always, and usually people have a reason for that. Number 39, do you expect families to function differently in a resource-based economy than they do in a monetary-based society? If so, how? Thus far, I have concluded that by removing the stress of acquiring money to secure the necessities of life, it would greatly benefit the family structure as parents would be able to focus on raising their children to be productive members of society as opposed to having them spend so much time worrying about mortgage payments, utility bills, etc. Yeah, you answered your own question. I think family, well, first of all, poetically speaking, family is a bit of an elite institution, is it not? It's time people spread their awareness, and people don't need homage to their family. What's the term I'm looking for here? They don't need to be dedicated to their family solely and take their family more important than anybody else. In time, I think that people will begin to expand to see their community as a family. Actually, the greatest metaphor is sort of Italian mafia thing. You have of course, the immediate family, which is, of course, extremely important. Then you have the quote, family of people that are in the social organization of organized crime. And this is just almost equally as important as their normal family. That's why it's called the family. And I hope that in time the family will extend to all human beings. I say that poetically. Honestly, if you go back far enough, we're pretty much all related. Genealogy-wise, it's amazing how fast we're multiplying, and we're very much related to more people than everyone's related to many more people than they really understand. And that shows a great deal of extensionality too. If you are being very selfish and self-preserving, and you're involved in corporations that are polluting, if you begin to think about, say, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, at what point do you stop caring about your offspring if you are associated with that sort of family, respect? You know what I mean? I hope you know what I mean when I say that. So, as far as, the money aspect, yes, families will have much less stress, and people will have much less stress. So I hope that answers your question. I think the family will be restored, but I also think the family will evolve. Number 40, did Jacques Fresco's ideas, and specifically his idea of a resource-based economy, derive from technocracy? Mr. Fresco stated at a speech that he resigned from technocracy because they were racist. About how does that mean he did not get this? Excuse me, I'm sorry, I misread that. He resigned from technocracy because they were racist, but how does that mean he did not get his idea of a resource-based economy from them? I think Jacques was influenced by technocracy. I also think technocracy was a natural concept. It wasn't something that you needed to see an organization in order to get the idea. I think we're all influenced by everything around us. Jacques participated in technocracy, from what I understand. He didn't like the fabric of the organization, even though the ideas, generally speaking, were positive. I'm sure there were influences, but I think he influenced them actually more so. He did a lot of contributions to technocracy before he became disgusted by the social problems that technocracy was perpetuating. So I don't think that really matters. It's really the train of thought that's important here, not where they come from per se. Number 41, I have told several relatives about this movement, and they have tried to denounce the idea, and their excuse to me is that the Venus Project may fail because anarchy would arise since no one would have to work. Do you see or know of a good way to combat this accusation? Well, I would have to say that the people that say things like that are just projecting. They're projecting their ignorance and assumptions that have no real basis. It isn't freedom that causes problems, like free time. It's oppression, really. I mean, people will learn to respect society, for society takes care of them. I find it difficult to believe that random anarchy would just arise because people are bored. I think there will be culturally so much to do that that people will have fascinating things to engage in, and so-called anarchy or destruction, in other words, will do nothing but subside. Number 42. I heard how several senators, most notably the Rockefellers, are trying to pass a new bill through Congress to allow Obama to shut down or erase any information on the Internet, known as the Cybersecurity Act of 2009. Yeah, this goes back to my point about the Canadian Act, and these things are coming around. And again, I think this has to be combated. I mean, we're going to have to take measures if these things start to go into congressional committees and they're actually put into legislation. Sadly, most of these aren't even made to the public. Most of this stuff's not even made aware to the public until after they're done. So then it becomes a protest issue. Again, I think the public really, I don't think the public's just going to roll over if they start doing these things with the Internet as far as making subscription-based services and restricting information. I think in America, the Internet serves as that last little hope of freedom that people, keep entertaining in this system, and their assumption of this illusion of freedom that America poses. And if they really want to shoot themselves in the foot, once they start restricting the Internet, I think it might even work to our advantage into an odd way, because I don't think they'll get away with it for one, and it'll just cause that much more upheaval against the profit system and the self-preservation mechanism of government. Number 43, do you know of Auroville, and if so, what do you think of it, Auroville? Is it perhaps a good example to demonstrate how human behavior changes when people no longer are forced to submit to authorities or compete against each other? I have looked at the website for Auroville. I didn't know about it prior to this question, and it looked really interesting, and it looked very positive. It's essentially, for those out there that don't know it, if you type in Auroville, you'll be taken, I believe it's in India, and there's a commune type of environment where, I use that term loosely, I can't think of another way to describe it. I think it's more sophisticated than that. But they have a very unique layout and interesting technology that's being put to use to feed many, many, many people. Very positive, very interesting, still obviously within the monetary system, but things like that I'm looking into. I might attempt to visit places like that for the third film, just to give examples of progress in regards to social issues. As far as your second question about human behavior, I don't know enough about how they're behaving in that environment to answer that question, so I'll have to research that more. Number 44. This might be outside of your knowledge, but here in Sweden we have a lot of ecological products. I believe this is known as organic in the United States. I wonder if this is generally a good thing that should be supported, or is it more of a marketing ploy? I would have to say it's both. Green issues have become very popular. There are many different labels that they put on food. A good one is free range. You see that. People like to feel humane when they buy free range chickens. Well, the definition of free range that most people assume is that you take a chicken, you take whatever the animal is, and you stick it outside and it gets to run around. That's actually not true. If you look at the definition of that, it's a lot more limited than that. It doesn't have anything to do with outside. It has to do with very loose distinctions of movement. It's really very misleading. Same with natural. You'll see things referred to as natural all over the place, and they can use that for just about anything. If you see something that says natural, just look at the chemicals in the back. Another one is organic. And organic is a second-tier distinction. You have 100% organic, and that is the most beneficial. Again, you can type this stuff on the internet and find the clinical definitions. 100% organic is different from just organic. Organic is only a percentage used of natural processes. And then you'll have things like made with organic ingredients. So you just have to look into that. It's definitely a ploy. I mean, there's a lot of ploys happening, but it's also positive too, because people are sick of being poisoned, and there's a new movement happening as far as this. Generally speaking, I think it's positive, but you have to watch out for people that use used in all natural, organic terms in very loose ways. You just have to look into it, and it is a form of advertising for many of them. Number 45, would a Venus society supply drugs to those who requested, i.e. marijuana, heroin? Should there be a line drawn between hard drugs and light drugs, and if so, how is that line decided? Well, I think hard drugs, all drugs will emerge whether they're restricted or not, I've come to find. The more you restrict certain drugs, the more underground drugs come to be, such as, PCP and all of these complex drugs that can be made from chemicals that people can find. There's a few examples of this. Crystal meth is one that can be basically compiled in a bathtub through basically items that most people can readily get. So, the issue really comes down to you have to make all drugs in transition. You use the model that the Netherlands are using, where they literally have less drug use per capita than the United States because they make it available, and they have clinics where people go to get off of heroin, and they give them clean needles, and it's supported socially. It's a very, very humane way to deal with this. I won't even go into many of the serious problems, but to answer your question simplistically, I think that drugs will need to be evolved out of, and they naturally will be evolved out of. Most people that gravitate towards the hard drugs tend to do so because of a certain disdain and of a boredom, of an emptiness, so to speak, and a depression. And again, I'm speaking very loosely. Many people defend drugs. I understand where people come from with things like that. In the end, nothing's restricted. Everything's available, and I believe there'll be a natural fade out of those drugs that are obviously detrimental. I mean, it's not a matter of legislation. It's a matter of just making it there and getting people out of that circle and making an environment that supports them and benefits them so they don't gravitate towards such escapism. Number 46, where do you get your news from? You said that you didn't own a television. You get most of your news from the net. What websites do you go to and can recommend for us to get news free from mainstream bias? That's a complex question. I didn't have a chance to go search too many things. I'm not at my central computer. There's lots of sites out there, but you have to pick and choose and understand the nature of the sites. Places like Drudge Report, Raw Story, Global Research.ca, even Alternet. These are decent places to go. I think what you really should do is I go to Yahoo too, and I look at New York Times and everything else. What you do is when you find a really important subject, you find something that catches your interest, that's when you start researching any alternative media you can find, because the mainstream is going to give you a surface report. And then it's the other independent journalists that are going to actually get to the bottom of it. That's the pattern that I've seen. So that's kind of the train of thought that I use. And I sometimes go into sites, I don't even know where I am, but I'm looking at the writers and I'm looking at their research and their references, and I get information out of it. The other thing that's fun to do in the United States, it's heavily regulated. So it's good to look at other press in other countries. Obviously, if you can't read another language, that's limiting, but international news can be very beneficial to see angles that you'll never see in the United States media. They just talk about things that are very different. It's amusing to me how many people in other countries are much more informed about political events than the Americans are. And I've seen examples of this in various documentaries and reports, and of course in the newscasts and, independent media that you tend to find. So I hope that helps. You have to cross-reference like crazy. But I've had a lot of luck with Raw Story and globalresearch.ca, and there's many other ones, but I don't have them all in front of me right now. I'll post something, actually, when I get back. Okay, where was I? Number 47. Why do you degrade metaphysics? Are you really neutral and open to all information? Okay, well, metaphysics. Metaphysics is essentially loosely defined as beyond the physical, if I remember correctly. In other words, those that use that term come in the context of psychics or telekinesis and moving things with your mind and bending spoons. And the bottom line is, regardless of what people say, regardless of the weird history, I've seen absolutely no evidence to support any of this. There's a great deal of fraud that begins, and the fraud isn't recognized, and it starts to carry through history and morphs, and it starts to seem like reality. There was one metaphysical notion that I used to entertain because I thought it was great poetry, and it took me a while to research it, and I realized it was nonsense. It's called the 100th monkey syndrome. And it was this bad science that was generated where they said all these monkeys, one place, were given this information about how to do something to feed themselves, then many miles away, some monkeys magically learned the exact same thing, and therefore there was some kind of conscious transfer. There might be some type of signal relationship to human awareness. I have no idea, but that was actually based on terrible science. It was actually done as a parable about the positive things by a man named Ken Kais. So, there's a lot of stuff like that out there. The real question is, the real point is that knowledge has a shelf life. And if I lived 5,000, 6,000 years ago, I would likely have large metaphysical beliefs. I believe in God, because I wouldn't have any information to tell me why things occurred. If it rained and my family was killed, I would look for meaning for that, and I'd probably find, I'd invent reasons, and that's basically what metaphysics kind of is a irrational form of invention or a projection of an assumption that has no basis. So the issue is what actually has feedback from the environment. If I stumble upon somebody who can move things with their mind, then I will stand corrected. But until I see that, I really can't support such notions. You have to go where the feedback is, where the ideas become supported. And unfortunately, metaphysicians, or whatever you want to call them, they're usually very poetic, and they very much mean well. And again, I used to share a lot of those beliefs many years ago, and I've grown out of those. And there's always going to be things that we don't understand. So I definitely understand that. But when I use the term, I'm talking about specific ideas of nature and human participation and thought and physical reality. And metaphysics has been proven in the sense of things being beyond the physical to not have a legitimate basis up to this point. Number 48, I think we need to discuss the resource-based economy. I think we need to discuss that a resource-based economy is not a form of government. Instead, it is a method of eliminating the actual need for government. Though the Venus Project does not call for anarchy specifically, members should realize that the state we will reach is technically anarchist in nature. Well, you're throwing out terms there that I don't necessarily use. I wouldn't say it's anarchist in any way, unless you just want to have a relativistic relationship to society today. I'd say it's radical. I'd say that in relationship to current ideas, it's radical. I don't think the term anarchist is adequate. Nevertheless, yes, you're absolutely right as far as the people need to understand that we're trying to transcend the institution of government as we know it. We don't need government as we know it, because government is a business. That's all it is. All we need is a social organization that enables us to get what we need, the utilities of life, utilitarian aspects of life, initially food, air, water, and the resources to live, and then we create all of the abundance of the so-called recreational and luxury. That would be the step-by-step process, and I think through time that's very easy to do. I don't see any reason why people can't have everything they have now in a resource-based economy. I think it's actually going to be magnified a great deal, and people have access to much more. And beyond that, beyond the distribution of abundance, we have to have intelligent management of the Earth's resources, and that's where the larger order systems come in, because those are the resources that provide for our needs. And of course, we'll have to continue to do experiments and scientific inquiry about new ideas and relationship to any type of development that we might have an ambition for, such as terraforming other planets or going into space, whatever. Regardless, government is completely outdated. It's a self-preserving mechanism based on mafia tribes. We can't think that way anymore. It does absolutely nothing. All governments do now is make more and more laws. They put more and more people into prisons. They fight each other for resources, and they maintain their system of stratification and power. And government's absolutely pointless at this point. It's absolutely detrimental in all countries. It doesn't matter what their social system is either, by the way. At least the ones that exist. Number 49, I would like to know how I can explain Zeitgeist to people in a way as to make it important in their mind so that they can take the time to check it out. I experience a lot of, quote, it's a cult, just stop with it, unquote, kind of statements after people have gone to check out the website. Should I skip those kinds of people and just spread the movement to others? Well, I think, honestly, if you're going to get people that are just referred to as a cult with no form of thought, then absolutely skip them. There are so many people out there that do have open minds to at least a greater degree than many other people. If someone just dismisses you and walks away and calls you an idiot, don't waste your time. Don't battle people with this. get into intelligent conversations about it, the moment debates start, you have to begin to start to back down and start to take your initiative somewhere else. Don't go for an ego thing either. I mean, I don't do that. You can't do that. You can't. It doesn't work like that. So I hope that makes sense. And one thing I'd also recommend, I think I had said this before as well, you need to use the PDF and the films, because those are very targeted, and I think they do a good job. So once you get the door open, and you say, oh, I have this idea that someone was telling me about, I want to know your opinion. As I said before, that's a great way to approach people. And then present them with the physical information, and then they can learn it on their own accord. And you get back to them and say, hey, what do you think of that manual I sent you? And then hopefully they'll have a critical response that's thoughtful and not just dismissive. And if they're just plainly dismissive, then move on. There's no point in wasting time, because there are many, many people out there. And once this sort of mass consciousness starts to awaken with those that can take in the information, those that have the tools to think clearly about this, then it will begin to spread in a social trend mechanism, and people will want to relate to it because that is actually their way of identifying with society. And as you know, we are definitely social organisms, and people will believe things even if they don't understand it. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but I think that might be part of the pattern of unfolding with this process of awareness. Number 50, I was listening to your address last week, and I can't remember exactly what you stated, but it was something to the effect that advertising in a resource-based economy would be obsolete. And not only that, it is a bad thing in general. I am currently taking courses in college to become a graphic designer, which has a lot to do with advertising. I was wondering, is this line of work negative to the movement? Would I be able to use my skills to help, or would I have to help out in other ways? Well, first of all, graphic design, I used to do that. I mean, that's just an artistic form of communication to relay a point. I wouldn't even think about it in the context of advertising. I wouldn't even call it graphic design. You're working in the visual spectrum of communication and nothing more. So yes, absolutely, any form of communication is going to be positive. As far as your other point about advertising, yes, advertising will be obsolete as we know it today, which is a value system imposition, distortion, legitimately a brainwashing in the most derogatory form, in order to perpetuate the self-interest of corporations and to dominate value systems that help these institutions. So, yes, you can use your tools by all means. You're really in the field of communication. It's your decision to use it for good or bad purposes. Number 51, I would like to know what will happen to the music industry. For example, how do bands set up gigs, and how do they spread their music around? What about making movies and producing them, etc.? The big issue here is there's no profit motive. So first of all, those that are really dedicated towards music are going to do it because they like doing it. And that's a big difference. You're not going to have all of I think I commented on this before, by the way, but you're not going to have all of the groups that come out as corporate constructs, or groups that, or personalities that go into certain industries because they have a name and they can make money off of it. That's going to, first of all, weed out a lot of the noise in the musical system. I'm a musician. It's one of my romantic, associations. And basically, if you want a gig, there'll be culture centers for that. I think there'll be tremendous freedom for playing. You're not going to charge for it. You'll do it because you want to do it. And I think when it comes to making movies, and it would be the exact same process. People will come together that want to contribute and collaborate and produce a form of communication for some reason. I don't see it being, once you remove the profit motive, I think it will actually flourish in a much more positive way. Number 52, almost all people I have talked to about the Zeitgeist Movement have either shown heavy doubt from lack of imagination, or great interest in the ideas, but lack of willingness to do anything about it. I think a real understanding of how something like nanotechnology works, coupled with an imagination would break a lot of the defenses that people put up when arguing against this movement. Absolutely, and I'm glad you pointed that out. I agree with that entirely, and that's why the new film is going to. The new film is going to talk about very specific aspects of current technological development. I can't tell you, I don't want to jump ahead and say things that it might not happen, but I'm going to show the audience what is possible. So I've set this up in addendum, we've made the rhetoric, we've talked about it, now I'm going to prove it. And that's what this new film essentially is going to denote, apart from other subjects. So don't worry, we'll get there. Number 53, the interest of scientists in the fields of information technology and computer science and the Greek language stems from the fact that, quote, the advanced technology of supercomputers will only accept the Greek language as it is the only language capable of the comprehensive transmission of meaning, unquote. That's very interesting. This instead of being semiotic, it is neomatic. Well, I've never heard those terms. I proofed this question. I need to look more into it. And hey, if that's the case, then whatever works, my friend. I think we'll use whatever language is most effective, and I'm sure that those that work on systems of interaction now are very privy to that, and that might be something else that I talk about in the new film as well as far as that development. Number 54, have yourself or Jacques ever considered speaking at TED, the TED Talks? Yeah, there was feedback for TED, and apparently they're booked way in advance, and I think it's about time we contact them again. I'm glad you sent that question. The Venus Project, they sent an email to the Venus Project saying that they were completely booked, but were aware of them. So we'll see what we can do about that. I think that's a great idea. Number 55, regarding technological unemployment, would not the human labor that was replaced instead become a labor market of designers and technicians, for example, technicians to maintain the technology? This is a very common argument, and that's a very good question. And the fact is, it doesn't match. You can't match the loss of jobs with the creation of jobs by those who are implementing and fixing the technology. You'll lose 10,000, I'll give you a theoretical number here. You'll lose 100,000 people because of the advent of a new, say, textile machine, and then the company that produces the textile machine most likely only has a few thousand people. And those are the ones that are benefiting and have the jobs because of the technology. And as time moves forward, technology will be focused for efficiency, focused for updating themselves, focused for molecular self-repairing. They will be focused to work as long as possible and update themselves, as has been denoted loosely in the orientation guide. And again, I'm going to go into this in the film as far as advancements of machines and their awareness, and where maintenance of the machines almost becomes like a human. If they suffer a problem, they recognize it with their computerized system and they can address it. They can call other machines to help, and the humans basically oversee these machines. And of course, if they have to step in, they do so. But to answer your question, there's no way out of it. You can't match those lost by technological unemployment by the jobs created to create the technology. The numbers aren't there. It's just a fraction. So that can't work. That's a classic capitalist argument. Those are the ones that say that technological employment isn't a problem, and they use that argument, but it's absolutely unsupported statistically. Number 56. The Venus Project talks about starting new cities from scratch instead of modifying current buildings. While I do see how this is necessary, what will be done about older historical buildings? Jacques mentioned before that museum cities will exist, and I think that's actually a very great idea. I think some form of hybrid might be possible, but we definitely have to start. In order to get the real benefits of a city, you have to start from scratch because everything is so old in our current environment. The museum cities, just like we have ruins of the Mayans and things like this, I think they'd be preserved just for the sake of historical research and information. You'll find, however, that we don't live in the caves that might be denoted that our early ancestors lived in. So, there's a relevance to it, but as time moves forward, we'll outgrow the romanticism, and eventually, things will be overhauled. But again, museum cities, I think, will help people's nostalgia, so to speak. Number 57, with regard to active projects, in my honest opinion, there are more important issues around, quote, like Codex Alimentarius, the Federal Reserve, protecting the Internet, unquote, then trying to say, get Jacques Fresco back on Larry King. I'm all for informing people about the Zeitgeist Movement, but I'm more concerned with the pressing issues right now. I agree with you generally speaking. I agree, but the movement needs more support on the fundamental level. We need people to understand the movement and not see the movement as another engine of patchwork, which is really what the going after Codex Alimentarius and the Federal Reserve is. Does it need to be done? Absolutely, and I completely sympathize with that point. But I think when people understand the larger ramifications of the movement and get behind it, we will have a natural gravitation to go after any organization or anything that is detrimental to us. This will be a natural development, and I think we will go after those that are attempting to suppress the freedom of the Internet as it develops. I'm certainly behind that. Right now, we're still at a very early stage, and I'd love to see the public. I want to see the Zeitgeist Movement, the Venus Project, get into the public spectrum of awareness. It's just so important for that. We don't have enough numbers to do what we really need to do, as far as I'm concerned. So while I agree with you, I think spreading awareness is equally as important. But we'll be moving forward with more activist stuff as things go on, because there are many problems. For example, the military, there needs to be a coalition for intelligent technological development or something like that, because the military is beginning to use cybernated. They're beginning to put in blueprints to create cybernated weaponry, cybernated robots that can be sent in mass without a physical army to take over small nations if they wanted to with simple robots or remote-controlled drones. Once they have the capability to do that, we're going to see a whole new paradigm of problems. It's just going to, that's another thing that needs to be addressed. It's very important we fight that. Number 58, is there a clearly defined organizational structure and assigned leaders for the various teams of the Zeitgeist Movement? Who can we coordinate with in the overall organization to ensure that we are doing the best things and not wandering astray of the movement? Get in contact with myself and, of course, the Venus Project if you have a specific idea. Please do it. I mean, we love hearing ideas. I usually don't hear ideas. I just hear complaints and arguments from people, a lot of people that communicate with me. I mean, obviously, we're developing the chapters. We'll have the dominant website organization for each country, and then it dwindles down in a hierarchical structure, because that's the only way we can do it, into states and territories and cities and townships and the like, as far as the interests will go. But we all work together in a holographic manner, most hopefully, excuse me. So in time, I hope the awareness of this will be such that people will be able to act on their own accord. But if you have an idea, please just get in contact with us, media@thezeitgeistmovement.com, and I'll do my best to help. Really, I need people to help become a part of it on many different levels, and that's why I do have the projects teams and all of the things there. So please go there and check it out. That's the first step. And there's a lot more on the horizon as far as larger order developments, but we just haven't gotten there yet, and I haven't had the time to do as much as I wanted to do. It's amazing how fast the weeks go by. Number 59. My question is in regard to the dilemma which we face when we talk about a prototype circular city being created sometime in the future. How will this be funded? Would it be at all possible for Jacques to give us an estimate towards the cost of this prototype? Again, the prototype circular city is a research center, and I think the best process is someone donates the land, and then we have a fundraising mission solely for the development of the land, based on blueprints that would be developed, and then based on what we feel can be done, the cost would be arrived at. I really couldn't tell you the cost, and I don't think Jacques could either. I mean, it's not really the right question. The cost, I don't think, is much of an issue. It's really just getting it done and getting the resources to do it, and getting people to donate as well. I mean, if people really believe in this, then we're not going to have to hire a bunch of people. Let people begin to contribute because they want to benefit. They want to see the benefit of it in the larger extreme. So I hope that answers your question. Running out of time here, about 12 minutes left. Number 60. Number 60, what would the age of consent be in a resource-based economy? Would there be a need for age of consent laws? That's a very interesting question. What is the consent issue? Obviously, if you go from territory to territory and region to region, it differs dramatically. I don't know. I'm not of the ground to say what's right or what's wrong. Obviously, there's a biological issue with sexual participation. If a child hasn't hit puberty yet, I don't really think they should be having sex. But does that mean I'm right in that regard? I don't know. This is something that needs to have further analysis by the effects of such participation. I think the cultural distinction changes through time as well. So, in the end, I think there's a general, what you call moral viewpoint in regards to this that persists today, which might be in line with, conduct that seems to work in a decent way. It's such a complex topic. Would there be laws for it? I don't think laws would be necessary for it because it's a cultural type of development. It's a biological development more than anything else. And again, I don't have the answer to that. The real question is physiological and psychological, and understanding what the effect is over the course of time with different variations of, age relationships in regards to sexual activity, and of course, relationship between different ages. I personally, maybe it's my conditioning, I can't see a 40-year-old person having sex with a 15-year-old girl. Culturally, that is seemingly negative. But is it really wrong? I have no idea. I mean, these are difficult questions, and who knows what the future will hold as far as the way we'll think about that. I don't see that as an extremely relevant question to the larger order things that we're dealing with. Obviously, consent is consent. So, that's another issue too, but that consent also depends on education. So I'm going to leave it at that. I can't really answer that question. Number 61. I would call many of the musical instruments that I have one of a kind. I disagree with your generalization that scarcity always results in conflict. People in the music community I'm involved with appreciate the uniqueness of each other's instruments because we are sane individuals. Many creative creations of people would be considered one of a kind with present-day technology. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. I mean, musical instruments are generally made by corporations, and while they might have different colors or you might do something custom with them, the utility is still the same and they're still accessible. I mean, I'm a musician. I have instruments that have been custom made for me, and I don't see them as scarce at all. Other people can get them if they want to. I mean, the real issue is utility. Scarcity of dire resources like food and tools, that's what causes problems. And I think almost anything in time will be able to be duplicated. The notion of art is, you could call it scarce, and I've addressed this question before. It's not really a real issue. Again, the Picasso example is a classic one. I'll state that real fast. If you have a painting, people in this culture buy paintings from artists, original paintings, and they go for millions of dollars. And why do? They do it for ego status, relationships, and for monetary resale value. That's why they do it. There's no reason, for example, you don't have people going and buying the first reel-to-reel of most bands. They don't really think about that. Artists, because one, they can't put it on display. It's not interesting to look at, even though theoretically it's basically the same idea. Is it really that much different to look at a picture that has the paint on it, that's dried, as opposed to a print? In the advanced forms of printing, I bet you they could recreate it in a way that you wouldn't even tell the difference. So, in the end, it's an egotistical-based thing, this whole idea of artistic originality and, I guess, hence artistic scarcity. And I consider it a non-issue. We can recreate just about anything for everyone to have. I really think in time that such notions will just fade into nonsensical, the category of, they will fade into the irrational category where people don't even think that way. And again, it won't even be supported by the environment as far as the reactions, because we can produce a multiplicity of things that people might consider to be one of a kind. There really is no such thing as one of a kind, unless you think of things as everything is one of a kind, because everything is slightly different in some way. So I hope that makes sense. That's an interesting question. I've answered that question better before, but I'm going to move on because we're running out of time. Number 62, a person I really care about acknowledged the truth about the film and the movement when I showed her. She became passionate about it, showed the film to her family at a local gathering. They berated her because of the ideas, especially the corruption that exists because of the monetary system, and now the ideas and philosophies you put forth have caused a massive rift in the family. How should I think about this and react? It has affected me very personally. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Families are no different than other people in regard to communication. I would say that if it's causing problems, stop talking about it. I don't know what, everyone has to deal with it in their own way. I say that we move towards those that have like-minded ideas, that we can share these ideas with, that have a larger probability of understanding and relating to them. They have the tools to understand it. Those stuck in traditionally oriented mindsets are naturally going to have a massive problem with many of these ideas. And I just say, roll with it, and just stop talking about it. And tell her that she should, if it's causing conflict, then just change the subject. That's really all I can say. You have to roll with it, and there's no clear answer for that. Number 63, where do you draw the line? Is it right for us to force a person who dresses differently, such as goths, into mental health facilities just because we believe the person is mentally disturbed? Well, no one's ever advocated that. I mean, there's a big difference between somebody who's mentally disturbed that's afflicting harm on somebody else and somebody who has a very unique form of personal expression. The real issue, ultimately, and there are gray areas here, and it's for a much larger topic, is what one person's doing, is it negatively affecting somebody else? And usually that argument is supported by a tangible effect, such as somebody walking up to somebody else and hitting them. That's obviously a problem. and you have to figure out how to deal with that. As far as people getting tattoos and things like that, mental health facilities, no. I mean, education perhaps might help people that maybe have some hyper-obsessive nature about maybe perforating their skin and things like that, but it's not, I don't think that's much of an issue for a resource-based economy in regard to what we're describing. I mean, we just want to make sure that things that have a positive effect are reinforced in the environment, and things that have an obvious negative effect are not reinforced. And subtle attributes, such as aberrant behavior that's just really minimal, but it's not something that necessarily hurts somebody else directly, that behavior is not reinforced. It's not rewarded. So I hope that makes sense. We have about 4 minutes left. We're going to go to 64. Number 64, how would a human that is an adrenaline seeker get along in the new system? For example, if a man gets a thrill driving fast, loud, and knowing that he has a chance of crashing and injuring himself, will this behavior fade? Yes, I think that behavior will fade because it's based on boredom. You know, I watched a movie called Man on Wire, which I thought was a really unique psychological treatise, both positive and negative, a man who tied one cable to another on the World Trade Center. It's a great film to watch. And there's two sides of it I thought were unique. One side was beautiful, the effect that there was this individual that actually had the mental stability to learn something and had enough trust in himself to walk from one wire to another. And without any real hesitation, the height did not faze him. The prospect of death did not faze him at all. At least certainly didn't appear that way. Confidence was incredible. Self-confidence. On another side, what the hell is the point of that? What is the fundamental aspect of what he's trying to communicate? Would he do that in a vacuum? Was it only for him? Did he want to be seen? Is it a cry for attention? I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I think people that do things for adrenaline purposes, you have to ask them what the reason behind it is. Is it just for the rush? If it is just for the rush, then that's great. I think there's plenty of circumstances where people can be put in what you call risky scenarios, which I think could be made more safe, but yet they still maintain that fabric of risk, just rock climbing and stuff like that. And I think there's a place for all of that. You know, I don't see any real issue with that. But if you put other people in danger, that's where the problem is. If someone's wanting to put themselves in danger, well, then that's their interest to do so. You can't stop somebody from not having a harness and just randomly climbing up a rock, the side of a mountain, and with the possibility of slipping and falling. But the moment they start to affect other people and put other people in danger, that's when things need to be addressed. So that's the real issue. All right, 2 minutes left. Number 65. In Zeitgeist, you feature Krishnamurti, whom I'm a fan, and his views on consciousness. You also feature Ram Dass and Bill Hicks. Are you a materialist or idealist, or do you not know? Sometimes I hear you say things that seem materialist, and other times you sound spiritual. This confuses me. I'm afraid your question sort of confuses me, too. I feature different individuals for different frames of reference for those that are watching the films. There's a strategy to the people that I've chosen to put into the films, and it's not necessarily that I agree with everything that certain individuals say. For example, the first film was a hodgepodge of many different personalities, many of which I don't necessarily agree with their larger philosophies. I'm not talking about Krishnamurti or Ram Dass or Bill Hicks per se. I'm just putting this very generally out there. Everyone has unique contributions. There's very unique individuals like Bill Hicks that have had tremendously wonderful and acute angles on social aspects that I relate to. I don't know if I call that materialist or spiritual. I really don't understand your question, I'm afraid, because you're giving me terms that I can't relate to. But I hope I sort of made the point as far as why I use those individuals. There's a benefit to certain attributes that they talk about, but it doesn't mean that I support their larger philosophies, if they even have any. Some of them I don't necessarily even. And last question, 66. If I've been well understood from what I've been hearing, you do not embrace the global warming theory because somehow you're endowed with the seriousness of it. But if this theory isn't against the scarcity system and the oil corruption domain, shouldn't the movement adopt the theory as an argument? As an argument against the abuse of nature, absolutely. But I don't promote something that might not be true. That's all I can say about that. And I'm now running out of time, and I really appreciate everybody listening in. And I will be back in 2 weeks. I might come back in another week. We'll see. But everybody have a great week. And I might do this more frequently. I'll talk to you all soon. Thank you very much. Bye.